Hello and welcome to Game of Box Office. Today's prediction is about Spectre. Spectre is the 24th part of the Bond franchise and builds on the enormous success of the three previous Daniel Craig films and for the most part on the huge success of Skyfall. Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace and Skyfall especially made Bond a giant in box office again. In order to predict Spectre, we will be comparing it with Skyfall in all aspects. Spectre was published in 3,929 cinemas and has exceeded the release of Skyfall by 403 cinemas total. That's a big pro point for Spectre. Skyfall was produced with a budget of $200 million, whereas Spectre, according to Forbes, The Times and other magazines, currently sits at a gigantic budget of $270 million. These costs place Spectre on 4th place of the most expensive films ever made. Both films have a similar length. Skyfall lasts 143 minutes, Spectre 148 minutes. For this reason, the same number of screenings per screen can be performed per day. Both films have a PG-13 rating and neither of the two was released in 3D. Skyfall and Spectre were released at the same time of year, even on basically the same weekend. Skyfall on November 9th, 2012 and Spectre now 3 years later on November 6th, 2015. Both movies started their run in a time frame that is rather far from public holidays. Now you have to keep an eye on which competitors the movies were or up against. A week after the opening weekend of Skyfall, the film had already had to compete with the box office giant Breaking Dawn Part 2, which opened to $141.1 million. The following weekend saw the release of Life of Pi, and the 5th weekend The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. Even though Twilight and The Hobbit not quite target the same audience as a James Bond movie, these movies are so big that they must be mentioned as a great competition. To sum it up, in the first big weeks, Skyfall had to compete with two huge franchises and a mid-sized film. Spectre meets The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2 on the 2nd weekend, which represents the final of a huge franchise and will likely end up in the same opening weekend region as Breaking Dawn Part 2. The week following Mockingjay Part 2 stars The Good Dinosaur, whose box office performance is very uncertain yet, and 3 weeks later launches Star Wars: The Force Awakens. So here we have in the first 6 weeks 2 huge blockbusters from major franchises and 1 medium-sized film. Although one could argue that the second blockbuster in this case appears 1 week later than with Skyfall, but we also have not involved In the Heart of the Sea in the calculation, which starts its run 1 week before Star Wars. So basically we have in terms of competition the same situation. Almost everything except the cinema count is consistent, but where the films differ is unfortunately in terms of quality. Skyfall was loved by critics and the audience and was described by quite a few people as one of the best, if not the best Bond of all time. Spectre, however, has a 62% rating at Rotten Tomatoes, a 60% rating at Metacritic, a 7.4 rating at IMDb and an A- cinema score from audience. So the movie is across the board far below Skyfall. So how did Spectre kick off? Spectre is estimated currently to an opening weekend of $72.5 to $74.3 million. For comparison, Skyfall had an opening weekend of $88.3 million. $40 million more than Spectre with 403 cinemas less, and although the ticket prices went up in the last 3 years. The overseas comparison is rather difficult here because Spectre and Skyfall were not released simultaneously in the same countries. The hype for Spectre is obviously huge, but over the long run it will not hold as well as Skyfall. Therefore, the margin from the head start that Spectre has will decrease fast. The obvious question is how the expected foreign market of the last 3 years will help Spectre grossing more, but we will think it will not be enough to go equal. Skyfall had made a total of $304.3 million in the USA and Canada, as well as $804.2 million in the rest of the world, for a combined total of $1.1 billion. Where will Spectre probably end up in the end? We think that a sum of $930 million worldwide would be more realistic. $230 million in the USA and Canada, as well as $700 million in the rest of the world. However, it has to be noted, we can be very wrong with the overseas numbers. We do not know how Spectre will behave over the long run and how the expansion of the overseas market in the last 3 years will affect Spectre. Also, it has to be noted that Spectre's quality unfortunately is not high enough to survive the release of other films without damage. So what can we say in conclusion? Spectre is a spectacle of a movie and the box office giant regardless of the final outcome. The film almost entirely lives off of the bombastic hype of Skyfall, yet it is 100% safe to say that Spectre will end up below the total gross of Skyfall. Skyfall kind of reinvigorated the Bond franchise after many were let down by Quantum of Solace. Spectre right now is way more like a so-so installment of the Bond franchise, rather than a standout event movie. If you like, you can compare Skyfall and Spectre with the first Avengers and Avengers 2 Age of Ultron. Spectre is far away from being a movie with bad reviews and bad reputations from the audience, just like Age of Ultron to Avengers, but it will land somewhere behind Skyfall. Is that bad news for the Bond franchise? Of course not. Bond is and remains huge, and with the expected numbers, Spectre will be number 2 in the domestic market, in the overseas market, and total just behind Skyfall. A brief note at the end. Of course, Spectre has been released, but we have set the limit that a prediction is feasible as long as the film does not boost any final weekend revenue in the USA and Canada. Movies that exceed this point will belong to the analysis category. Our next video is an analysis about Inglourious Basterds, The Martian, or a prediction about The Hateful Eight. We hope you enjoyed this prediction. Be sure to hit a like and subscribe to our channel. You can also support us on the social networks listed below. See you soon. Bye bye.